So far, we've seen what happens when we declare a variable and define its value immediately. Now we'll see what happens when we want to declare a variable without giving it a value. So far, we've declared all of our variables using this format: the keyword var, the name of our variable, in this case my var, equals, and then some value. Now when we declare a variable, we actually do not need to initialize the value, and that means we can actually leave off the last two parts here, the value and equal sign, and simply be left with var, and then the name of our variable, in this case my var. So what happens when we declare a variable in this way? Let's save this out, jump into our browser. Now we've run our page as we've refreshed it, and if we actually test out in our JavaScript console down here, my var, we'll see that the value that it gives us back is undefined. Now undefined represents a non-value that was never defined. Now there's another non-value called null. Undefined and null are very similar, but null can be used when you simply want to indicate that a variable truly is empty, and that it's not simply empty by default. So how can we test to see if a variable is defined? Well, we've declared my var here, and its value is undefined, so let's try to see if we can evaluate whether or not it is undefined using a piece of code. We're going to use console.log. And this is built into our browser, and what this allows us to do, as we've seen before, is print out text to our JavaScript console that we have in the bottom of our page. We simply pass it a value, and it'll print it out to the console that we have on our page. So to get a true or false value based on whether it's undefined, what we can do is use the type of operator. That's typeof. And you'll see we have it highlighted here because it's a keyword in JavaScript. The way typeof works is we use the typeof keyword and then the name of a variable. In this case, my var. So if we pass in this, let's see what happens in our console. If we refresh, we can now see this line here, undefined. So when we do type of an undefined variable, we get the string undefined. Now if we wanted to test if a variable is undefined, for instance for use in an if statement, we can use this expression, type of my var equals equals equals, and then the string undefined. And what this is doing is it's taking the type of my var, which in this case will be the string undefined, and comparing it to another string undefined. The three equal signs is the operator that will test for the equality of both sides of it. So if we have the string undefined on the left and the string undefined on the right, this will all evaluate to true. So let's test it out. And now we can see console.log now evaluates to true. So if you ever want to test to see if a variable is undefined, that's how we can do it. Now you may see in some other code testing for undefined in a different way. So let's try console.log, and we'll do my var, and without the type of operator, we will compare it to undefined. And this is undefined the keyword, not the string. So instead, we're simply testing if my var itself is equal to undefined. Now if we test this out, it appears it's true. And so you may think, hey, that's an easier way to test for it. Why don't we always do that? Well, undefined in JavaScript is actually a bit of a quirky keyword in that it's not really a keyword at all. It's actually a variable that's set by JavaScript. And because of that, it's possible to accidentally overwrite the value of undefined, or perhaps intentionally overwrite the value of undefined to mess up somebody else's code. So what happens if somewhere else in your code, we said something like undefined equals true? Now you may think that's pretty silly to be allowed, and it kind of is, but this is something that can actually happen in your code, so you need to be very careful when testing for undefined. So if undefined equals true is somewhere in our code, and we run it, instead of true, true, now we get true, false. So that's why we can't trust the actual undefined value that we have here. Now there are ways that we could enforce that our undefined is untampered with. However, it's best practice just to use type of my var is equal to the string undefined. That way you can be pretty sure that my var is truly undefined, And undefined itself, if its value has been tampered with, it doesn't matter. So we talked a little bit about how undefined represents an empty value, meaning that it hasn't been set to. But what about null? For instance, we could say var x equals null. And null is a keyword that means nothing or empty. So both null and undefined are what we call falsy values. If we remember, in an if statement, if we have a falsy value, if will not execute. So we could, for instance, say my var. And in the if block here, we'll do console.log if, and we'll use an else here. And in the else block, we'll do console.log else. So now we'll see which of these two get printed to our code. In this case, we can see else because my var has the value undefined. And let's see what happens if we put in x. Again, we see else. And that's because null and undefined are both falsy values like false or the number 0. Now, because undefined and null are so similar, oftentimes we want to check if a value is either null or undefined. But sometimes we want to do something different if it is actually false or the value 0. So if we want to check for either of the empty values, null or undefined, one easy way we could do this is to do our variable equals null. Now you may think that only works for null, but let's check it out. So right now we have x equals null. And as you might expect, if we run it, we see the if statement executes. And that's because x is null, and null equals null. Makes sense that it would be true. Null is null. But let's see what happens if we do my var. So does my var equal null? Well, it's undefined, so you'd think it might not. But if we refresh, we see that it does. That's because the equals or double equal operator is not strict in how it compares things. Sometimes it'll sort of change the value when it evaluates it. So, for instance, undefined and null are so similar that the double equals operator considers them to be equivalent. So I'm going to comment out this undefined equals true for the purposes of demonstration here. So we have the true value of undefined available to us. And if we were to check undefined equals null, we see that it evaluates to true. You'll remember that there's also a triple equals operator, and this is the strict equality operator. And this will not change values if they're close enough to each other. So if we do undefined equals null, we'll see it's false, because strictly they're not equal, but conceptually they kind of are, which is why double equals returns true, and triple equals returns false. In most cases, you want to use the triple equals because you don't want any unexpected changing of variables when comparing them. But in this case, when checking something double equals null, it has the convenience of allowing you to check if it's null or undefined. So this is a special use case that you can use if you ever want to check that a value is either null or undefined, as opposed to null, undefined, false, or 0. Up next, we'll see how variables are accessible at different points in our program by learning about variable scope.